The year 1874 bled across the New Mexico territory in shades of rust and sun-bleached bone. Dust was the price of every breath, a fine grit that settled in the lungs and on the soul. For June, 19 years old and running for her life, it was the only constant. It choked the air, filmed her vision, and rose in furious clouds from the hooves of the horses that were about to be her undoing. The stagecoach bucked like a wild thing, its timbers groaning in protest. Outside, the world had dissolved into a maelstrom of gunshots and savage yells. The driver, a man whose name she'd learned was Silas, slumped forward with a final, ragged sigh, his hold on the reins going slack. The man beside him with the rifle was already gone. A dark shape tumbled into the sagebrush. They were alone. The two other passengers, a woman in a feathered hat and a portly man with a sweat-stained collar, were screaming, their cries thin and useless against the roar of the attack. June didn't scream. The sound was trapped behind her teeth, a hard, sharp stone of terror. She clutched the canvas satchel on her lap, its contents a secret so heavy it felt like it could drag her down to hell. Her knuckles were white, the rough fabric digging into her skin. This was him. This was Abner's doing. The cruel rancher her father had bound her to. A man whose ownership felt like a brand on her spirit. Had sent his dogs. He'd known she would run. He'd probably been counting on it. The coach lurched violently to one side as a rider pulled alongside, his face a leering mask of grime and tobacco-stained teeth. He smashed the butt of his pistol against the window, shattering the glass and sending shards flying. The woman with the feathers shrieked, covering her face. June saw her chance. It wasn't a chance for survival. Not really. It was a choice between two different ends. One was certain, in the hands of those men. The other was a gamble against the unforgiving land. Without a second thought, she threw her shoulder against the opposite door. The latch was old and rusted. It held for a moment, then gave way with a splintering crack. The door flew open, revealing a blur of churning ochre earth and thorny scrub. The wind tore at her, whipping her plain calico dress around her legs, trying to pull the satchel from her grasp. She took one last look at the screaming woman, a ghost in a life she was leaving behind, and then she jumped. She hit the ground with a force that knocked the air from her lungs. She rolled, the satchel clutched to her chest, feeling rocks and thorns tear at her dress and skin. The world was a spinning, painful kaleidoscope of sky and dirt. The sounds of the ambush faded behind her, replaced by the ringing in her own ears and the frantic, ragged sound of her own breathing. When she finally came to a stop in a shallow, dusty arroyo, she lay there for a moment, stunned, her body screaming in 1,000 different places. Pain was a fire licking up her side where she'd landed, and her palms were scraped raw. But she was alive. She pushed herself up, ignoring the dizziness that threatened to pull her back down. The satchel was still there, its drawstring tight in her fist. The stagecoach was 100 yards away, now stopped, surrounded by the riders. She couldn't watch. She couldn't think about the other passengers. To think of them was to let the paralysis win. She turned and ran. Her flight was a blind, desperate scramble. She ran without direction, guided only by the instinct to put as much distance as possible between herself and the sounds of violence. The sun, a merciless white eye in the vast blue emptiness, beat down on her head. Her bonnet was long gone, and her dark hair, unpinned and wild, stuck to her sweat-slicked neck and face. The landscape offered no comfort. It was a broken, brutal place of cracked earth, skeletal mesquite trees, and rocks that shimmered with heat. Every shadow looked like a man. Every gust of wind sounded like a pursuing horse. Thirst came quickly, a dry, rasping thing that made it hard to swallow. Her lips cracked, her tongue felt thick and useless in her mouth. She kept on, stumbling over rocks, her worn leather shoes offering little protection. The hem of her dress was shredded. her arms and legs cross-hatched with bleeding scratches from catclaw acacia. She was just another creature fleeing a predator in a land that was indifferent to both. Hours bled into one another. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. The heat lessened, but a new kind of fear arrived with the lengthening shadows. She knew the stories of what came out at night, the four-legged predators and the two-legged ones. She was weak, exposed, and leaving a clear trail for anyone who knew how to read the land. And Abner's men knew. She clutched the satchel, its weight both a burden and a reason. Inside was the proof, the ledger, the letters, the things that confirmed the dark whispers she had overheard, the whispers that had given her the courage to flee, the whispers about her mother's death not being an accident. Abner couldn't let that proof exist. He couldn't let her exist. Her strength was failing. Her vision swam, the landscape wavering before her eyes. She tripped, her ankle twisting beneath her, and she went down hard, the side of her face scraping against the gravelly soil. This time, she wasn't sure she could get up. Tears of frustration and pain welled, hot and useless. She had come all this way, survived the jump, only to die of thirst and exhaustion in this wasteland. It was a cruel joke. Then she heard it, faint but unmistakable, the gentle murmur of water. Hope, a thing she thought had been baked out of her, surged through her veins. It gave her the strength to push herself to her hands and knees. She crawled at first, then staggered back to her feet, hobbling in the direction of the sound. It led her over a small rise, and there, nestled in a crease in the land, was a sliver of impossible green, a trickle of a creek, barely more than a foot wide, weaving its way through a cluster of hardy cottonwoods. She half ran, half fell down the gentle slope, landing on her knees at the water's edge. She plunged her raw hands into the cool stream, splashing the water onto her face, her neck, drinking it in desperate, greedy gulps. It was silty and warm, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. For a moment, she forgot everything else. There was only the water and the profound relief of it. That's when she saw the fire. It was small, just a handful of embers glowing in a ring of stones not 20 yards away. A bedroll was laid out beside it. A horse, a powerful-looking dun with a dark mane, was tethered to a tree, its head lifting at her scent. And then she saw him. He moved from the shadows near the horse, and, for a terrifying second, her heart stopped, believing they had found her. But this was not one of Abner's men. This man was alone. He was tall, lean-hipped and broad-shouldered in the way of men who spent their lives in the saddle. He wore plain, trail-dusted clothes, dark denim trousers, a faded flannel shirt, and a scuffed leather vest. A gun belt was slung low on his hips, the handle of his Colt worn smooth. He moved with a quiet, deliberate economy. No wasted motion. As he stepped into the dying light, she saw his face. It was a hard face, carved by sun and wind, with a strong jaw shadowed by a day's worth of stubble. He wasn't handsome in the way of townfolk, but there was a raw, stark reality to him that was more compelling than any polished charm. And his eyes, they were deep-set and dark, and they watched her with an unnerving stillness, revealing nothing. He had made no sound, yet she felt utterly exposed, like a rabbit caught in the open. She froze, still on her knees by the creek, water dripping from her chin. Her frantic escape had led her directly into a stranger's camp. She had traded one danger for another, unknown one. He didn't speak. He just stood there, watching her, his expression unreadable. He wasn't reaching for his gun, but he didn't look welcoming either. He looked like a part of the landscape unforgiving, silent and ancient. She could feel him assessing her, the torn and filthy dress, the wild hair, the scratches, the desperation that must have been written all over her face. Her mind raced. Should she run again but where her ankle throbbed, and her body was a canvas of pain? She had nothing left. The sun had finally sunk below the horizon, and the twilight was a deep, menacing purple. The cold was beginning to creep in. The cowboy, this stranger, represented her last infinitesimal chance. It was a chance as thin as a spider's thread, but it was all she had. Terror and desperation warred within her, but desperation won. She pushed herself to her feet, her movements clumsy with exhaustion. She took a hesitant step toward him, then another. The horse snorted softly, the only sound in the sudden stillness of the evening. The man remained motionless, his gaze never leaving her. She wanted to beg, to plead, to pour out the whole sordid story and pray for his mercy, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat was too tight, too raw. What could she say? How could she make him understand the life-or-death reality of her situation without sounding like a madwoman? She stopped a few feet from him. The scent of wood smoke and coffee hung in the air around his camp. It was a smell of simple, solitary existence, a world away from the violence she was fleeing. She looked from his unreadable face down to the canvas satchel she still held in a death grip. It was the only thing she had. It was her story, her burden, her only piece of leverage. Slowly, as if it weighed 100 pounds, she lifted the bag. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, but from a fear so profound it was a physical tremor. She held it out to him, a silent offering, a plea. He didn't move to take it. His dark eyes flickered from the bag to her face. He was waiting. She finally found her voice. It came out as a ragged, broken whisper, a sound scraped from the very bottom of her soul. "Please, sir," she breathed, the words barely disturbing the quiet air. "Don't let them take me." The silence that followed her whispered plea stretched thin and tight, as brittle as a dry twig. The cowboy, Cole McCrae, did not move for a long moment. His dark eyes held hers, and in their depths, June saw nothing she could name. There was no pity, no curiosity, no welcome. There was only a profound stillness, the kind found in the heart of a stone or the center of a storm. He was weighing her words, her presence, her desperation, against the solitude he had clearly chosen. She expected a shake of the head, a pointed finger back the way she came, an order to leave his camp and take her trouble with her. Her own life, she realized, hung on the infinitesimal movement of his expression. Then he broke his stillness. It was not with a word, but with an action as decisive and final as a closing door. He turned from her, took 2 strides to his small fire, and with the side of his heavy leather boot, he kicked the dry earth over the glowing embers. The coals hissed. A plume of gray smoke rose and was instantly snatched away by the night breeze. And then there was only darkness where the small circle of warmth and light had been. He stamped down the dirt with a grim finality, erasing his camp, erasing his brief pause in this unforgiving landscape. He turned back, a tall, broad silhouette against the star-dusted sky. He gave a short, sharp jerk of his head toward the darkness beyond the creek, a gesture that was not an invitation but a command. "Follow." June didn't need to be told twice. Scrabbling to gather what little dignity she had left, she clutched her satchel and limped across the shallow creek, the cold water a shock to her throbbing ankle. He was already untying his horse, the dun, moving with a fluid efficiency that spoke of a life lived in rhythm with the land. He didn't offer her a ride. He simply took the reins and started walking, his long strides eating up the ground. June hurried to keep up, her breath catching in her throat, a painful stitch forming in her side. They moved through a world stripped down to its essentials. There was the crunch of their boots on the gravelly soil, the sigh of the wind through the sparse, skeletal creosote bushes, and the immense, overwhelming silence of the desert at night. The moon had not yet risen, but the sky was a deep, velvet black, so saturated with stars they seemed to cast a faint, ghostly light of their own. Great mesas and saw-toothed ridges loomed in the distance, their shapes cut from the fabric of the night. It was a beautiful and terrible landscape, a place that cared nothing for the small, desperate dramas of men and women. Cole never looked back to see if she was following. He didn't need to. He knew she was there, a shadow dogging his steps, her ragged breathing a faint counterpoint to the steady rhythm of his own. He walked with the unerring certainty of a man who knew every rock and every arroyo, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness around them. He was a creature of this place, as much a part of it as the coyotes that yipped and howled in the far-off hills. June watched his back, the solid line of his shoulders, the easy way he carried himself, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, a sliver of something other than pure terror found purchase in her heart. She was not safe, not by any means, but she was not alone. The ground was treacherous, littered with loose rock and thorny plants that snagged at the tattered hem of her dress. Her ankle was a ball of fire, and every step was an agony. But she didn't slow, didn't complain. To fall behind was to be left, and to be left was to die. So she bit her lip against the pain, focused on the steady, rhythmic swing of his arm as he walked, and forced her legs to move. The satchel banged against her hip, a constant, heavy reminder of why she was running. They walked for what felt like hours. The world remained a vast and empty panorama of shadow and starlight. They crossed dry, sandy washes where the air was still and held the memory of the day's heat, and climbed over low, rocky ridges where the wind blew cold and sharp, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. He seemed to be following a trail that only he could see, a path woven into the very fabric of the wilderness. Finally, he stopped. He had led them to the base of a low, flat-topped butte that rose abruptly from the desert floor. Tucked into its shadow, almost invisible against the dark rock, was a structure. It was an old, derelict barn, a relic from some long-failed attempt to tame this land. Its wooden walls were the color of sun-bleached silver, warped and splintered by decades of relentless sun and wind. The roof sagged in the middle, and the large double doors hung slightly askew on rusted hinges. It looked abandoned, forgotten, a place where memories went to die. Cole led his horse toward the silent structure. He pushed one of the great doors, which protested with a low, mournful groan. A wave of air, thick with the scent of old, dry hay, dust, and the faint, musky smell of pack rats, washed over them. It was a place of deep, profound stillness. He led the dun inside, the horse's hooves thudding softly on the hard-packed earth floor. June hesitated at the threshold, peering into the cavernous darkness within. Moonlight now filtered through the cracks in the walls and the gaps in the roof, striping the interior with faint, silvery lines of light. She could see empty stalls, a broken wagon wheel leaning against a wall, and a hayloft that was little more than a shadowy maw overhead. Cole ignored her, his first priority being his animal. He untied his bedroll and saddlebags, setting them on the ground, then proceeded to unsaddle the horse with practiced, gentle hands. He spoke to it in a low, soothing murmur. Sounds too soft for June to make out the words, but the tone was one of familiar, easy affection. He led the horse to a stone trough in the corner, which she now saw was fed by a slow seeping spring at the base of the rock wall. After the horse had drunk its fill, he tethered it loosely in one of the stalls, leaving it to nose through a small pile of feed he poured from a sack. Only when his horse was cared for did he seem to remember her. He turned, his face a mask of shadows in the dim light. He looked at her standing in the doorway, a wayfish figure of exhaustion and fear. He didn't speak. He simply lifted his chin and nodded toward the far corner of the barn, where a pile of old, loose hay lay scattered on the floor. It was the only comfort the place had to offer. June understood. She limped inside, the great door groaning shut behind her, plunging them into a deeper darkness. The sounds of the outside world, the wind, the insects, the vast emptiness were suddenly muted, replaced by the close, intimate sounds of the barn, the soft snuffling of the horse, the creak of the old timbers settling, the scuttling of some small creature in the rafters. She made her way to the corner and sank down into the hay. It was prickly and smelled of dust, but after the hard, unforgiving ground, it felt like a feather bed. She pulled her satchel into her lap, hugging it to her chest like a shield. She was too tired to move, too scared to close her eyes. Cole settled himself on the other side of the barn, near the door. He didn't unroll his bedroll. He sat with his back against the wall, his long legs stretched out before him, his hat tipped low over his face. He looked as if he were resting, but June knew he was not. There was a tension in his posture, a coiled stillness that was not restful. He was a watchman at his post. The night wore on, a slow, agonizing crawl of minutes and hours. Sleep was an impossible dream. Every time June started to drift off, a sound would jerk her back to full, heart-pounding awareness. The wind rose, and it began to keen through the cracks in the barn walls. A high, lonely, whistling sound. It sounded like voices whispering just beyond the walls, like searchers calling her name. The dun stamped a hoof in its stall, the sound like a gunshot in the heavy silence. June's own heartbeat was a frantic drum against her ribs. She lay there, listening to the night, and listening to the man across the barn. She listened to the sound of his breathing, slow and steady. It was the only calming thing in her world. It was a rhythm that said he was there, a solid presence in the terrifying dark. But the silence between them was a physical thing, a chasm that separated them. He had saved her, for now. But he was a stranger. She knew nothing of him, not even his name. She had thrown herself on his mercy, and he had given it. But it was a cold, wordless mercy. She thought of Abner's men. Were they still out there? Were they casting about in the dark, searching for her trail? The image of their faces, cruel and leering, flashed in her mind. She could imagine them finding the abandoned stagecoach, finding her footprints leading away into the wilderness. They wouldn't give up. Abner would not allow it. He would hunt her to the ends of the earth for what she had taken, for what she knew. The fear, which had been a hot, frantic thing, now settled into a cold, hard knot in her stomach. It was a certainty. They would find her. It was only a matter of when. And what would this silent man do? Then would he hand her over? Would he fight? She had no right to ask him to risk his life for her. The weight of it all pressed down on her, suffocating her. The silence in the barn felt more menacing than the wind outside. She had to break it. She had to put a voice to the terror, if only to prove to herself that she still had one. She shifted in the hay, the rustling sound loud in the stillness. Across the barn, she saw his head tilt slightly. He was listening. Her voice, when it came, was no more than a dry, rustling whisper, a sound meant only for the darkness and the man who shared it with her. "If they find me," she breathed, the words tasting of dust and despair, "I'll die." Her words, a fragile admission of terror, hung in the thick, dusty air of the barn. Cole did not reply. He didn't offer empty comforts or ask for explanations. He simply remained a solid, unmoving shadow across the way. And in his silence, June found an odd, anchorless space. It was not comforting, but it was not threatening either. It was simply present. She had spoken her greatest fear aloud, and the world had not ended. The man had not moved. She eventually drifted into a shallow, fitful sleep born of pure exhaustion, her hand never leaving the rough canvas of the satchel. She awoke to a bar of pale, milky light slanting through a gap in the roof, illuminating a universe of dancing dust motes. For a confused moment, she didn't know where she was. The scent of dry hay and old wood filled her senses, and the memory of the past day crashed down on her with the weight of a physical blow. The jump from the coach, the desperate flight, the silent man. She sat up slowly, her body a symphony of aches and pains. Her ankle was swollen and a deep, angry purple. Across the barn, Cole was gone. Panic, cold and immediate, seized her. He had left He had abandoned her in this ruin, leaving her to her fate. She scrambled to her feet, a cry catching in her throat, her eyes darting wildly around the empty space. Then she saw it, just outside the great, slightly ajar door. A tiny, smokeless fire of dry mesquite twigs burned in a small pit. Cole was hunkered beside it, a battered tin pot balanced on the flames. His back was to her, but his posture was alert, his head angled as if listening to the desert morning. He was not gone. He was keeping watch. The panic receded, leaving a hollow, trembling feeling in its wake. She must have made a sound, a rustle in the hay, because without turning, he spoke. His voice was a low rumble, rough around the edges like he didn't use it often. "There's coffee." It was the first complete sentence he had directed at her. It wasn't a question or an invitation, just a statement of fact. June limped toward the door, her bare feet shrinking from the cold earth floor. She stood in the entryway, squinting against the new daylight. The world outside was painted in the soft, hopeful pastels of dawn. The air was crisp and clean. He glanced over his shoulder at her, his dark eyes taking in her disheveled state. He gave a slight nod toward a second tin cup sitting on a flat rock near the fire. Then he turned his attention back to the pot. The message was clear she was welcome to it, but he wasn't going to serve her. Hesitantly, she stepped outside. The coffee smelled rich and strong, a civilized aroma in this wild place. She picked up the cup. It was warm from the fire's proximity. She watched as he expertly lifted the pot and poured a stream of steaming black liquid into his own cup, then gestured with the pot toward hers. She held it out, and he filled it. Their hands were inches apart. His were calloused and brown from the sun, his knuckles scarred. They were capable hands. She mumbled a "thank you," the words feeling foreign and clumsy. He didn't acknowledge her thanks, but sat on the rock, sipping his coffee and staring out at the vast, empty expanse of the territory. June found a spot on an old, overturned watering trough a short distance away. The hot, bitter coffee was a shock to her system, but a welcome one. It cut through the fog of exhaustion and fear, sharpening the edges of the morning. They sat that way for a long time, in a silence that was different from the one in the night. This was a shared silence, punctuated by the whisper of the fire and the occasional stamp of the horse inside the barn. The sun climbed higher, burning the pastels from the sky and turning it a fierce, unforgiving blue. She didn't know why she started talking. Perhaps it was the coffee, or the simple, human act of sharing a fire with another person. Perhaps it was the way he didn't press her, the way his quiet presence created a space that words could, for the first time, fill. "My father," she began, her voice quiet and raspy. "He was a good man, once, before my mother passed." Cole didn't look at her, but she saw his shoulders tense slightly. He was listening. She was everything to him. When she was gone, something inside him broke. He started spending his nights in town, at the saloons. He was looking for a way to forget. I suppose he found it in whiskey and cards. Her own hands tightened around the warm tin cup, the memories a bitter taste in her mouth. "He wasn't a good gambler. He lost our land, piece by piece, the small ranch my mother had loved so much. One night, he came home, and he looked older than I'd ever seen him. He told me he'd made a deal. His debts were cleared. All of them." She paused, swallowing hard. "He told me I was to be married, to the man who owned his debts, Abner Finch." The name fell into the quiet morning like a stone. She saw Cole's hand, the one holding his coffee cup, still. "Finch is a powerful man in this territory. He has the biggest ranch, the most cattle, the most men, and he is not a kind man. My father told me I would be his wife, that I would be mistress of a great estate. But I knew what it was. I was the final payment, the last thing he had left to sell." She looked down at her scraped hands. "I went to live at his ranch. It wasn't a home. It was a A cage, a gilded one, but a cage all the same. Finch watched me constantly. He wasn't forceful. It was something colder. He liked the power he had, knowing I was his property, that I couldn't leave. He told me the contract my father signed was ironclad, that I belonged to him, by law and by right. She took a shaky breath. I tried to be dutiful. I tried to be what my father wanted me to be, but the place was suffocating. There was a cruelty in the air, in the way Finch spoke to his men, in the way he treated his stock. It was a house built on fear. She fell silent, lost in the grim memory of it. Cole still hadn't moved, his profile a hard line against the bright sky. He was giving her the space to tell it in her own time. My mother, she continued, her voice dropping lower, died in a riding accident 2 years ago. Her horse was spooked by a snake. They said, threw her against a rocky outcrop. That was the story everyone knew. The story I believed. She set her cup down, her hands trembling too much to hold it. A few nights ago, Finch was drinking with his foreman. They thought I was asleep. I was in the sewing room, mending one of his shirts, and the window to his study was open. I heard them talking, laughing. The foreman was congratulating Finch on his good fortune, how everything had worked out for him. He said it was a good thing that snake had been so cooperative. And Finch, he laughed. He said my mother's land was far more valuable than her company had been. The horror of that moment was as fresh as if it were happening right now. The casual cruelty, the monstrous truth revealed in a drunken boast. I felt the floor drop out from under me. It wasn't an accident. It couldn't have been. The next day, when Finch was out on the range, I went into his study. I didn't know what I was looking for. I just had to know. In a locked drawer in his desk, I found a box. She gestured to the satchel, which she had brought out with her and now rested at her feet. It was all in there. Letters, a ledger, a deed transfer for my mother's land, signed over to him under suspicious circumstances just weeks after her death, and a letter to a man I'd never heard of, paying him a substantial sum for pest removal around the time she died. It was proof. He hadn't just taken my future. He had stolen my past. He had taken my mother from me. Tears she hadn't known were left finally fell, tracking clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. I knew I couldn't stay. To stay was to let him win, to let him bury the truth forever. I took the box, a little money, and I ran. I paid for a seat on the first stagecoach heading east, hoping to disappear. But he must have realized what I'd done as soon as he found the box missing. He sent his men, and now you know the rest. She finished, her story laid bare in the quiet morning. She felt empty, scoured out. She had given him the truth, a truth so heavy she could barely carry it. She waited for his judgment, for his dismissal. Cole remained silent for a full minute, finishing his coffee in slow, deliberate sips. Then he stood up. He walked over to the fire, rinsed both his cup and hers with water from his canteen, and carefully packed them away in his saddlebag. He didn't say a word about her story. He didn't offer a single word of sympathy or condemnation. It was as if she had been speaking to the wind. A part of her felt a sharp sting of disappointment. But then he started to move. He walked to the sagging barn door. He ran a hand over the splintered wood, tested the rusted hinges that groaned in protest. He looked at it for a long time. His eyes narrowed in calculation. Then he went back to his saddlebags and pulled out a small leather roll. From it, he took a handful of old, square-headed nails and a small, heavy hammer. He went back to the door and began to work. June watched him, mesmerized. He didn't have the proper tools, but he made do. He used the hammer to straighten the bent hinges as best he could, his blows precise and economical. He drove new nails into the frame, securing the loose boards. He found a thick, solid piece of timber from a broken stall and worked it into a position where it could be used as a heavy crossbar, a brace to lock the door from the inside. His movements were slow, methodical, and filled with an undeniable purpose. He wasn't just fixing a door. He was building a fortress. Each hammer blow was a punctuation mark to the story she had told, an answer given not in words, but in sweat and labor. When he was satisfied with the door, he moved to the small seep spring in the corner of the barn. He knelt and spent a quarter of an hour clearing away the small rocks and silt that were impeding the flow, his long fingers working carefully in the mud. The water began to run clearer, faster. He took his canteen, let it fill with the fresh, clean water, and then he walked over to the pile of hay where she had slept. He set the full canteen down, just within her reach. He said nothing. He didn't even look at her. He just left it there, a silent offering. His final act was to prepare food. He gathered more of the dry, dead wood and built another small, smokeless fire. From his packs, he produced a slab of jerked beef and a small sack of beans. He sliced the beef with a hunting knife and set the beans to heat in a small pan. The simple, savory smells filled the air. When the food was ready, he divided it onto 2 tin plates. He took one for himself and sat back down on his rock, eating with the same slow, deliberate pace he did everything else. The other plate, with its portion of beans and strips of jerky, he carried over and set down on the dirt floor. A few feet from the canteen, it was an offering, just like the water, a statement that she was under his care. For now, he was providing for her, protecting her, without a single spoken promise. His kindness was as quiet and as vast as the desert around them. It was a silence that spoke louder than any words ever could. The days settled into a rhythm, as stark and unvaried as the landscape itself. A routine was built not on words, but on shared space and silent observation. Their world shrank to the silvered walls of the derelict barn, the small, life-giving seep spring, and the circle of scorched earth where they made their small, cautious fires. Time was marked by the sun's relentless journey across the sky and the slow, westward creep of the butte's shadow. Cole was a man of immense and disciplined silence. He moved about his tasks with a quiet purpose that June began to find calming. He was the first to rise, his movements a series of fluid, practiced motions in the pre-dawn gloom. He would check on his horse, the dun he called Dust, murmuring to the animal in that same low, rumbling tone he rarely used for her. Then he would venture out, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 3, a rifle cradled in the crook of his arm. He always returned as silently as he left, occasionally with a rabbit or a pair of quail slung over his shoulder, but more often empty-handed. He was not hunting for sport. He was hunting for survival, and he took nothing more than they needed. June, in turn, found her own purpose in the small domestic sphere of their strange cohabitation. She kept the barn as tidy as a place of dirt floors and splintered wood could be. She refilled the canteens from the spring he had cleared, the water now running cool and sweet. She learned to grind the handful of coffee beans he rationed each morning, the aroma a small, fierce luxury that cut through the ever-present scent of dust. Their lives were parallel lines that, for now, ran in the same direction. They ate together, sitting on opposite sides of the fire, the space between them filled with the crackle of flames and the vast, humming silence of the desert. But the lines were beginning to curve, to bend toward each other in small, almost imperceptible ways. The first lesson came on the 3rd morning. He had returned from his patrol and was kneeling by the creek bed, his gaze fixed on the sandy soil. June, fetching water, saw the intense focus in his posture. She hesitated, not wanting to intrude on his solitude. He must have sensed her presence, because he spoke without looking up. "Come here." His voice was not harsh, but it held an authority she felt compelled to obey. She limped over, her ankles still tender, and knelt beside him. He pointed a long, calloused finger at a series of faint depressions in the sand. To her, they were meaningless marks. "Coyote," he said. He traced the outline with his finger, showing her the shape of the pad, The 4 distinct toe marks, the slight drag of the claws. See how the edges are sharp? It's fresh, maybe an hour old. He was headed north, toward the rocks. Then he pointed to another, similar track a few feet away. This one's older. Yesterday, maybe, the wind has softened the edges, filled it in a little. He looked at her, his dark eyes serious. You ran, he said, and it was a statement, not an accusation. You left a trail a child could follow. Your shoes have a worn heel. You favor your left foot. Every step you take tells a story. You need to learn to read the stories others leave, and how to hide your own. For the next hour, he became her teacher. He showed her the delicate, 2-pronged track of a deer, the frantic, scattered prints of a jackrabbit, the sinister, deliberate line of a snake's passage. He taught her how to tell the difference between a man's track and an animal's, how to gauge weight and speed from the depth and spacing of the prints. He made her touch the earth, feel its texture, understand how a footprint in soft sand differed from one in hard, baked clay. At one point, to show her how to measure the stride, he took her hand and placed it on the ground, his fingers guiding hers, showing her the span between one heel print and the next. His touch was brief, impersonal, purely functional, but a jolt of warmth shot up her arm. It was the first time he had touched her. The next day, he taught her about snares. He produced a coil of thin, flexible wire from his saddlebags. A gun is loud, he explained, his voice low. It brings attention. A trap is quiet. It works while you sleep. He showed her how to form the wire into a loop with a slip knot, how to find a game trail, faint, narrow path through the sagebrush worn down by the repeated passage of small animals. He demonstrated how to anchor the wire to a sturdy bush and position the loop at just the right height to catch a rabbit's head. His hands, which she had seen as instruments of hard labor fixing doors, handling a horse, holding a rifle, were surprisingly deft and gentle as they manipulated the thin wire. You try, he said, handing her a length of wire. Her fingers were clumsy. She fumbled with the knot, the wire kinking and bending in the wrong places. Frustration pricked at her. This was a skill so far removed from the sewing and cooking that had defined her world. She felt useless, a burden. She was about to give up when his hand covered hers. Slow, he murmured, his voice close to her ear. Don't fight it, just guide it. He moved her fingers, his thumb pressing against her knuckle, showing her the subtle twist needed to make the knot slide smoothly. Again. The contact was fleeting, but it left a lingering heat on her skin. This time, she didn't pull away. She leaned into the instruction, and a moment later, she had a working snare in her hand. A small, fierce surge of pride went through her. He saw it in her eyes and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was more rewarding than a stream of effusive praise. While he was teaching her to survive in his world, she was quietly trying to bring a piece of her own into theirs. One afternoon, while he was out on one of his long, silent patrols, she noticed a tear in the sleeve of the flannel shirt he had left draped over a stall door. It was a long, ragged rip, probably from a thorn bush, in the bottom of her precious satchel, tucked away in a small cloth pouch. Was her mother's sewing kit a few needles, a thimble, and spools of sturdy thread. It was one of the few personal things she had managed to grab. She took the shirt and sat in a patch of sunlight filtering through the barn door. The flannel was rough and worn soft with use, and it carried his scent of faint, clean smell of leather, wood smoke, and the dry desert air. As she worked, her stitches small and even, she felt a strange sense of intimacy, of caring for him in the only way she knew how. It was a quiet act of gratitude, a stitch for every lesson, for every plate of food, for the canteen of water he left for her each morning. She finished the repair, the line of her dark thread almost invisible against the worn fabric, and hung the shirt back where she had found it. He never mentioned it, but that evening, she saw him run his thumb over the mended seam, a brief, thoughtful gesture, before he put the shirt on. He didn't have to say anything. She knew he had understood. She began to observe his habits. She noticed that after their evening meal, he would always sit on the same flat rock just outside the barn, the one that caught the last rays of the setting sun. He would clean his rifle or sharpen his knife, his movements methodical, his gaze fixed on the western horizon. So, one evening, before he finished his meal, she took a tin cup, filled it with cool water from the spring, and set it on the rock where he always sat. When he went to his spot, he saw the cup. He stopped, his hand hovering over it for a second. He looked over at her, where she was pretending to be busy tidying their small camp. He didn't speak, but she felt his gaze on her, questioning and intense. Then he picked up the cup and drank, draining it in one long swallow. From then on, a cup of water on the rock became part of their evening ritual. It was her part of the conversation, her silent way of saying, "I see you. I am grateful." The distance between them was closing, not in miles, but in inches. The vast, empty space in the barn no longer felt like a chasm. They still slept on opposite sides, but the air between them was no longer charged with the fear of a stranger. It was filled with a different kind of tension now, a quiet awareness. She was intensely aware of him, of the sound of his breathing in the dark, of the way the firelight carved his hard-featured face into planes of shadow and gold, of the sheer, solid presence of him. He had become her protector, her teacher, her entire world. One evening, the wind was still and the air was soft after an unusually mild day. The setting sun had painted the clouds in hues of rose and violet. They had finished their meal of rabbit stew, and the quiet was comfortable, companionable. Cole was staring into the fire, his expression thoughtful, distant. June watched the flames dance in his dark eyes, and a wave of emotion so powerful it stole her breath washed over her. It was a confusing mix of gratitude, dependency, and something else, something deeper and more frightening. She thought of Abner Finch. She thought of his cold eyes, his proprietary touch, the kiss he had forced on her after the sham of a wedding ceremony her father had arranged. It had been wet and brutal, a claiming, not an act of affection. It had tasted of whiskey and ownership, and it had left her feeling soiled, branded. That was her only experience of what was supposed to be an intimate, tender act. The words rose in her throat before she had a chance to stop them. They were a confession, a clarification, a desperate need to be seen as something other than the sullied property of another man. She looked at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I have never been kissed," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She saw his gaze shift from the fire to her face, his eyes sharp and focused. She had his full attention. She had to make him understand. "Not a real kiss," she clarified, her voice trembling slightly. "Only the one my father said I must call my husband." She let the ugly truth of it hang in the air between them. It was the last, most vulnerable piece of herself she had left to give. She had told him of her flight, of her mother's murder, and now of this small, deeply personal violation. Cole said nothing. The fire crackled, spitting a shower of sparks into the twilight. A coyote howled in the distance, a lonely, mournful cry. He just looked at her, his face unreadable in the flickering light. But it was not the blank, assessing gaze of their first meeting. This was different. His eyes held hers, and the silence stretched on, no longer comfortable, but charged with 1,000 unspoken things. He looked at her for a very long time, and in the profound, unnerving stillness of his gaze, she felt as if he were seeing all the way down to the bottom of her soul, and he didn't look away. The morning after her confession was draped in a new kind of silence. It was no longer the comfortable, parallel quiet of two strangers sharing a space, but something heavier, more fragile. June felt as if she had peeled back her own skin and left her raw, trembling self exposed in the cool desert air. She had expected him to say something, anything, a word of pity, a grunt of acknowledgement, even a gruff dismissal. But Cole had simply banked the fire and retreated into his own impenetrable stillness, leaving her words to hang in the darkness between them. She avoided his eyes as they shared their morning coffee. She focused on the steam rising from her tin cup, on the way the new sun cast long, sharp shadows from the mesquite bushes. She felt his gaze on her, but she could not bring herself to meet it. She had said too much. She had taken the quiet safety he had offered and burdened it with the ugliness of her past. She was sure he regretted his kindness, regretted ever letting her into his solitary camp. Cole, for his part, was more silent than usual. He cleaned his rifle with slow, deliberate strokes, his movements as economical as always, but there was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. Her whispered words from the night before had landed on him with the force of a physical blow. He was a man who understood violence, survival, the harsh calculus of the frontier. He was not a man who knew what to do with the delicate, bruised tenderness of a woman's soul. Her confession had not been an accusation, but it had drawn a stark line in the sand, separating his world of simple, hard realities from the world of complex, human cruelty she had escaped. He didn't have the words to bridge that gap. He only had actions. The day passed in this state of suspended animation. The air between them was thick with things unsaid. The small, emerging rituals, the cup of water on the rock, the mended shirt, the lessons in tracking felt hollow, their simple meaning complicated by the new, raw knowledge that lay between them. June knew she could not stay in the barn forever, a passive, grateful refugee. She needed to contribute, to pull her own weight, to prove she was not simply a burden he had been saddled with. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent and the heat finally lost its brutal edge, she saw that their pile of firewood was dwindling. Here was a task, a simple physical thing she could do. "I can gather more wood," she said, the sound of her own voice startling in the quiet. Cole looked up from the harness he was mending. He studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face. He was likely weighing the risk of her leaving the relative safety of the barn against the need for fuel. He finally gave a short, single nod. "Don't go past the dry wash. Stay where you can see the butte." It was a boundary, a leash, but it was also a permission. She took the small hand axe he kept with his gear. He didn't offer it, but he didn't stop her when she took it and a length of rope to bundle the wood. Stepping out of the barn's shadow and into the golden light of the late afternoon felt like stepping into another world. The desert, which had been her prison and her terror, now looked different. She saw it through the lens of his lessons. She noticed the way the wind had sculpted the sand into delicate ripples, the lacy tracks of a lizard near a rock, the determined green of a hardy creosote bush. She walked toward a scattering of dead silvered ironwood trees near the edge of the wash, the butte a constant, reassuring landmark over her shoulder. The work was hard. The wood was dense and dry, and the axe, heavy in her unaccustomed hands, felt clumsy, but she welcomed the ache in her muscles, the sting of sweat in her eyes. Each swing of the axe was a small victory, each splintered branch a tangible accomplishment. She was not just a girl who was running, she was a woman who was surviving. The sounds of her labor, the sharp crack of wood, her own ragged breathing were a welcome noise after the strained silence of the day. She worked until she had a sizable pile, her hands raw and blistered, a satisfying soreness spreading through her back and shoulders. The sun was low now, a fiery orange ball kissing the horizon. The sky was awash in brilliant, bleeding colors, and the air had grown cool and soft. It was time to go back. She bundled the wood with the rope, grunting with the effort of hoisting it onto her shoulder, and began the walk back to the barn. As she cleared the rise that overlooked their camp, she stopped. Cole was not by the fire pit. He was standing by the old, broken-down corral fence that bordered the barn, a relic of its former life. He was just standing there, one hand resting on the top rail, looking out at the sunset, waiting. Her heart gave a painful, powerful thud against her ribs. He was waiting for her. It was a deliberate act, a departure from their routine. He had come out to meet her. All the anxiety of the day, all the fear that she had alienated him, coalesced into a single, sharp point of hope so intense it was almost painful. She started walking again, her steps slow, uncertain. The bundle of wood on her shoulder felt impossibly heavy. The 100 yards that separated them felt like a mile. He didn't move as she approached, just watched her, his tall frame a stark silhouette against the glorious, dying light. The world seemed to have gone silent. She could no longer hear the evening insects or the whisper of the wind. Only the sound of her own boots on the dusty ground and the frantic, hopeful beating of her own heart. She stopped a few feet in front of him and let the bundle of wood slide to the ground with a dusty thud. She was breathing hard from the exertion. She pushed a stray, sweat-dampened strand of hair from her face and finally met his eyes. They were dark and serious in the twilight, but the hardness was gone. In its place was something else, something deep and searching. She was suddenly aware of her own appearance, the grime on her face, her dress torn and stained, her hands scraped and dirty. Her eyes stung from a day of sun and dust, and she knew they must be red-rimmed and raw. All the vulnerability she had felt the night before came rushing back. She had to make him understand. She had to say it again, not as a confession of a past horror, but as a statement of her present self. "I've only ever kissed one man," she whispered, the words a mere breath of sound, almost carried away by the evening breeze. It was all she had to offer the stark, unvarnished truth of her own innocence, tainted but not destroyed. Cole's gaze never left her face. He seemed to drink in her words, to understand the weight of them, the courage it took to say them again. He pushed himself away from the fence and took a slow step toward her. Then another. He stopped when he was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She had to tilt her head back to look up at him. Slowly, as if not to frighten a wild creature. He lifted his hand. It was not a sudden movement, but a deliberate, gentle unfolding. She flinched, an involuntary reaction born of past cruelties, but his hand did not stop. It came to rest on the side of her face, his thumb stroking gently along her jawline. His skin was rough, calloused, but his touch was incredibly, impossibly soft. It was not a touch of ownership, it was a touch of reverence. He searched her eyes, a silent question in their depths. She didn't look away. She stood her ground, her heart a wild bird in her chest, and let him see the fear and the hope and the fragile trust she was placing in his hands. He leaned down, closing the small space between them, and gently rested his forehead against hers. She closed her eyes. His skin was warm. She could smell the faint, clean scent of him, of leather and dust and man. It was overwhelming. It was wonderful. For a moment, they just stood there, breathing the same air, their foreheads pressed together in a gesture of profound, wordless intimacy. It was more tender than any touch she had ever known. Then he spoke. His voice was a low, rough whisper, a sound that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. "Then let me be the second." And he kissed her. It was nothing like the brutal, claiming act she had endured before. This was a question, a plea, a gentle exploration. His lips were soft, hesitant, barely brushing against hers at first, as if testing the waters, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But she didn't. She couldn't. She leaned into him, a small, silent surrender. His hand moved from her jaw to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling gently in her hair, holding her, supporting her. The kiss deepened, but it remained slow, unhurried. A conversation without words. It was a kiss that tasted of patience and respect, of the quiet desert twilight and a solitude he was now willing to share. It was a kiss that spoke of mended shirts and cups of cool water, of tracking lessons and reinforced doors. It was a kiss that acknowledged the ugliness she had known and sought to replace it with something clean and new and breathtakingly gentle. It was an apology for a hurt he had not caused. It was a promise he did not speak. When he finally, slowly, drew back, he kept his forehead pressed to hers. The world rushed back in the chirping of the crickets, the deep purple of the sky, the cool evening air on her heated skin. She opened her eyes. His were still closed, as if he were memorizing the moment. She had kissed one man before, a kiss of ownership and fear. But this, she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, was the first time she had ever truly been kissed. And in the quiet, profound space of that one gentle act, everything had changed. That kiss was not an end, but a beginning. It was a bridge built across a chasm of silence. And in the days that followed, they began to walk across it, tentatively at first, then with a growing, quiet confidence. The heavy, anxious silence that had followed June's confession was gone, replaced by a new quietude, one that was soft, breathable, and filled with unspoken understanding. The barn was no longer just a hideout, a temporary reprieve from danger. Slowly, imperceptibly, it was becoming a home. The morning after the kiss, June awoke to find Cole already by the fire, but he was not cleaning his rifle or staring out at the horizon. He was watching her. When her eyes fluttered open and met his, he did not look away. A slow, gentle warmth bloomed in his dark eyes, a softness she had never seen there before, and he gave her a nod that was more than just a greeting. It was an acknowledgement, a welcome. A new day had dawned, not just in the sky, but between them. Their routine, once a set of parallel tracks, now began to weave together. Their tasks became shared endeavors. When Cole went to check his snares, June would walk with him. No longer a clumsy student, but an able partner. She learned to spot the subtle signs of a promising game trail, and her eyes, once clouded with fear, became sharp and observant. They would move through the sagebrush in a comfortable quiet, his long strides matched by her lighter, quicker ones. A silent team united in the simple, essential purpose of providing for their small, two-person world. He, in turn, began to cede parts of his solitary domain to her. He watched as she transformed their corner of the barn. She found a flat, smooth stone that she scrubbed clean and designated as a surface for preparing food. She discovered a patch of wild mint growing near the spring and would steep the leaves in hot water. The fresh, clean scent. A welcome change from the bitterness of coffee. One day, using a needle from her sewing kit and a length of twine, she even fashioned a crude but effective curtain from an old grain sack to hang over the largest gap in the wall, an attempt to keep out the worst of the afternoon sun. He watched her do all of this, his expression unreadable. But when he came inside, he ducked his head under her curtain without a word, a silent acceptance of her mark on his space. The greatest change was in June herself. The haunted, hunted look in her eyes began to recede, replaced by a soft, steady light. The fear that had kept her perpetually hunched, as if expecting a blow, slowly uncoiled from her spine. She stood taller, and she began to smile, not just the faint, trembling curve of the lips that was her version of gratitude, but real, genuine smiles that reached her eyes and made them shine. The first time she truly laughed. It was a sound so unexpected it startled them both. Cole was attempting to reshoe his horse. Dust, a task that required both strength and a certain finesse. The horse, usually placid, was being cantankerous, repeatedly snatching its hoof away at the last second. On the third try, Cole lost his balance and stumbled backward, landing in a graceless heap in the soft dirt. His hat knocked askew. He cursed under his breath, a low, frustrated growl. June, who had been watching from the doorway, saw the look of sheer indignation on his face, and a bubble of pure, unadulterated amusement rose up inside her. A laugh escaped her, a clear, bright peal of sound that echoed in the quiet of the barn. Cole froze, looking up at her from the ground. His initial annoyance vanished, replaced by a look of stunned wonder. He had never heard her laugh before. The sound was like a drink of cool water in the desert. He stared at her, a slow, crooked smile spreading across his own face, a rare and precious thing. He didn't get up right away. He just sat there in the dirt, looking at her, and she kept laughing, a hand pressed to her mouth as if to hold it in, tears of mirth now streaming down her face. In that moment, surrounded by dust and the scent of hay, they were not a reclusive cowboy and a girl on the run. They were just a man and a woman, sharing a moment of simple, uncomplicated joy. That shared laughter opened a new door between them. It emboldened June. She had been the student, the one who was dependent on his knowledge. Now, she realized she had things to teach him, too. "I could make bread," she announced one evening, after a meal of roasted rabbit. Cole looked at her, then at their meager supplies. "We have flour," he conceded. He had a small sack of it, a staple for any man living on the trail. "But no oven." June smiled, a secret, confident little smile. "You don't always need an oven." The next day became the great bread-making experiment. She showed him how to mix the flour with water and a pinch of salt in a tin bowl. She taught him to find the wild yeast in the air, leaving the dough covered with a damp cloth in a warm patch of sun. The most difficult part was teaching him to knead. "Like this," she said, her own small, capable hands pushing and folding the sticky mass on their flat rock. "You have to be firm, but not rough. You're not fighting it. You're convincing it." He knelt beside her, his large frame making the space feel small and intimate. He watched her for a moment, then reached for a piece of the dough. His hands, so adept with a rope or a rifle, were comically clumsy with the soft, yielding dough. He pounded it, flattened it, his knuckles disappearing into the mass. June laughed softly. "No, no," she said, reaching out without thinking. She placed her hands over his, guiding his movements. "Slower, push, then fold. Like this. Feel the rhythm of it." His hands were huge and warm beneath hers. The rough texture of his calluses was a stark contrast to the softness of the dough. He froze for a second at her touch, then relaxed, allowing her to guide him. They worked together like that, their hands moving in unison, a silent lesson in gentleness and collaboration. A dusting of white flour settled on his dark stubble, and she reached up and brushed it away with her thumb, her touch lingering for a moment on his cheek. The air grew thick and warm, and it had nothing to do with the sun. She showed him how to wrap the flattened dough around a green stick and bake it over the hot coals of their fire. The resulting bread was not perfect. It was a little burnt on the outside and slightly doughy in the middle. But as they sat there, tearing off pieces of the warm, smoky-tasting bread, it was the most delicious thing June had ever eaten. It was the taste of partnership. It was the taste of home. As the days turned into weeks, another, more profound shift occurred. The physical space between them in the night began to shrink. It started with their bedrolls, which were laid out a little closer together each evening without any discussion. The nights in the high desert were cold, a fact that provided a convenient excuse, but neither of them believed it was just about the warmth. Then, one night, a sudden windstorm blew in, rattling the old barn and sending icy drafts through every crack and crevice. June awoke shivering, huddled deep in her thin blanket. In the dark, she heard Cole shift. She felt more than saw, him move closer. After a moment's hesitation, he lay down with his back to hers. The shock of it, the solid, living warmth of him against her, made her entire body go still. She could feel the hard muscles of his back pressed against her own, the steady, slow rhythm of his breathing. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was an intimacy far deeper than their kiss. This was trust. This was a silent declaration that the defenses were down. She expected to feel trapped, but instead, an overwhelming sense of peace and safety washed over her. For weeks, she had slept with one ear open, listening for the sound of approaching hoofbeats. for the click of a rifle hammer. But now, with his body shielding hers, a fortress of muscle and bone, she felt as if nothing in the world could harm her. He was her watchman, her guardian. His presence did not just protect her from the dangers outside. It protected her from the nightmares within. She relaxed against him, muscle by muscle, and for the first time since she had fled Abner Finch's ranch, she fell into a deep and dreamless sleep. From that night on, they always slept that way, back to back, a small island of warmth in the vast, cold darkness of the barn. It became the new normal. In the quiet moments before sleep, she would listen to his breathing, synchronizing her own with his. Sometimes, she would feel him shift, and his hand would brush against hers where their bedrolls met. It was a simple, profound connection, a conversation held in the language of presence, of shared warmth, of complete and utter trust. Their hearts, once so heavily guarded, were no longer on defense. And yet, the most important words remained unspoken. The three words that hummed in the air between them, that lived in their shared glances, in the way he would place a hand on the small of her back to guide her over rough terrain, in the way she would save him the best piece of bread. He had never said, "I love you." He had never said, "Stay with me." She wanted him to. She ached to hear the words, to know that this fragile, beautiful world they had built in the ruins of an old barn was not just a temporary shelter, but a place she could truly belong. But she was afraid to ask, afraid to break the delicate spell they were under. For now, it was enough. It was enough to lie in the darkness, the solid warmth of his back against hers, and to feel, for the first time in her life, completely and utterly safe. It was a love that was growing in the silence, as patient and as powerful as the desert sun. The peace they had built was a fragile, delicate thing, a spider's web spun in a ruin, beautiful and easily broken. For weeks, it had held. The quiet days had bled into one another, each one a small, perfect bead on a string, creating a necklace of shared solitude and growing affection. The outside world, with its dangers and its cruelties, had seemed to fade, becoming a distant, half-forgotten nightmare. But the desert does not forget, and men like Abner Finch do not forgive. The outside world was coming for them. It began with a sound. It was mid-morning, the sun already high and hot, beating down on the tin roof of the barn. June was inside, humming softly to herself as she repaired a small hole in one of Cole's saddlebags, her stitches neat and even. Cole was just outside the doorway, cleaning his colt with a small, oiled rag, his movements as practiced and familiar as breathing. The air was still and warm, filled with the scent of hay and the low buzz of insects. It was a scene of such profound domesticity, such settled peace, that the intrusion, when it came, was a violation. Cole froze. His hands, which had been moving in a slow, circular rhythm, went utterly still. His head lifted, his gaze fixed on the empty expanse of scrubland to the south. June stopped her work, the needle poised in midair. "What is it?" she whispered. He didn't answer immediately. He was listening, not with his ears, but with his entire body. He was a part of this landscape, and he could feel a discordant note in its ancient, silent song. "A horse," he said, his voice a low, flat rumble. One horse, moving slow, trying to be quiet. Fear, a cold and familiar serpent, uncoiled in June's stomach. In all their weeks here, they had not seen a single soul. No riders, no prospectors, nothing. Their isolation had been their shield. Now, a crack had appeared in it. Cole rose to his feet in a single, fluid motion, the clean parts of his gun snapping back into place with a series of sharp, metallic clicks. He slid the weapon into its holster. "Inside," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Get down." He pushed her gently but firmly toward the back of the barn, toward the loose pile of hay in the darkest corner. Beneath it was a shallow depression in the earth. Not a true cellar, but a small, hollowed-out space where the former owners might have stored root vegetables. It was cramped and dark, but it was the most defensible spot in the barn. "Get in," he ordered, his eyes already scanning the cracks in the wall, tracking the unseen rider's approach. "Take your satchel. Do not make a sound. Whatever you hear, whatever happens, you do not move until I tell you." His face was a hard, emotionless mask. The gentleman who had clumsily kneaded dough and smiled at her laughter completely gone. In his place was the stranger she had first met, the dangerous, solitary man of the wilderness. She wanted to argue, to say she would fight with him, but she saw the look in his eyes. He needed to focus. He needed her to obey. She scrambled into the shallow pit, pulling the canvas satchel in with her. It smelled of damp earth and dry rot. Cole began to cover the opening with loose hay, working quickly, expertly. Soon, only a small gap remained. He knelt, his face appearing in the sliver of light. "June," he said, and the use of her name was a sharp, intimate thing in the tense air. "Promise me." "I promise," she whispered, her voice trembling. He gave a single, sharp nod, his eyes holding hers for a fraction of a second. A silent, desperate communication passing between them. Then he pulled the last of the hay over the opening, and she was plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. She could hear the blood pounding in her ears. The world was reduced to what she could hear through the thick layer of hay and dirt. She heard Cole move to the side of the main door, placing himself out of the line of sight. She heard the soft thud of his boots on the earth. And then, nothing but the frantic beating of her own heart. The silence was an agony, a stretched, thin wire about to snap. Then, a new sound, the slow, rhythmic creak of saddle leather, the soft clopping of a horse's hooves drawing nearer. The horse stopped directly outside the barn. A moment later, a man's voice called out, lazy and confident. "Hello, the camp. Got a man in there just looking to water my horse. It's a long, dry ride to Socorro." June held her breath. It was a standard greeting on the trail, a way to announce a peaceful approach. But there was a false note in it, a predator's casual tone meant to disarm its prey. She heard no response from Cole. The silence stretched again. "Tough crowd," the voice drawled. Then, closer now, the crunch of boots on the gravel just outside the door. "I know you're in there. Saw your smoke from the ridge yesterday. I also know you ain't alone. Got a pretty little thing with you. Dark hair, blue eyes. Answers to the name of June." June's blood ran cold. He knew her name. "She's worth a fair bit," the voice continued. Conversational, chillingly pleasant. $500 from a fella named Abner Finch, a reward for her safe return. "Now, I can be reasonable. We don't need to make this difficult. You push the girl out. I give you 100 of it for your trouble, and I ride away. You can go back to whatever it is you do out here in the middle of nowhere." Still, Cole did not speak. He was letting the man talk, letting him reveal himself. A sigh from outside. "All right, have it your way." There was the sound of something being unfolded, a crackle of paper. "This here's a legal warrant issued by the territory for the arrest of one June Callahan for theft and breach of contract. I am a duly appointed agent of the law in this matter. You harbor a fugitive. You're obstructing justice. That's a hanging offense." The lie was slick and practiced. Abner Finch owned the local law, but this was no official agent. This was a bounty hunter, a wolf who had caught her scent on the wind. The great barn door groaned as it was pushed open a few inches, sending a bright, blinding shaft of light into the dusty interior. June, peeking through a tiny gap in the hay, could see a man's silhouette. He was tall and thin, wearing a long duster coat despite the heat. The sun glinted off the star of a tin badge pinned to his chest, a cheap, false prop. "Last chance, friend," the bounty hunter said, stepping inside. He let his eyes adjust to the gloom, his right hand hovering just over the butt of a holstered pistol. "Give me the girl." And then Cole moved. He didn't speak. He simply stepped out from behind the door. The confrontation was not one of words. It was a collision of two opposing forces, as elemental and as sudden as a lightning strike in a summer storm. The bounty hunter, for all his confident talk, was startled. He hadn't expected his quarry to be so close, so silent. His eyes widened, his hand darting for his gun. He was fast, but Cole was faster. The world exploded in a cannonade of sound. The roar of the gunshots was deafening, a physical blow that slammed against June in her hiding place. The air was instantly thick with the acrid, sulphurous smell of gunpowder. She heard a grunt of pain, a heavy thud, the splintering of wood as a stray bullet tore through the barn wall. It was over in 2 seconds. Then came a silence more terrifying than the noise. A ringing, profound emptiness. Dust motes, violently disturbed, danced in the shafts of light. The smell of gun smoke and sudden, coppery blood filled the small space. June lay frozen in her dark pit, her body rigid with terror. She repeated Cole's command in her mind like a prayer. "Do not move until I tell you." She waited. She listened. There was no sound, no movement. Had he won? Was he hurt? Was he? The silence stretched for an eternity. She could hear the bounty hunter's horse snorting nervously outside. But from within the barn, there was nothing. The fear was an animal, clawing at her throat. She had to know. The promise she made was warring with a desperate, frantic need to see if he was alive. Then she heard it, a soft, shuffling sound, a ragged, heavy intake of breath, followed by a low groan of pain. It was Cole. He was alive. The promise was broken. Love and terror were a more powerful mandate than any words she had spoken. She pushed frantically at the hay, scrambling out of the shallow pit, her eyes wild, her heart hammering. The scene before her was a tableau from a nightmare. The bounty hunter lay sprawled on the floor near the center of the barn, his duster coat spread around him like dark wings. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the rafters, a dark, spreading stain on his chest. The false badge on his chest was askew. Her wanted poster lay on the ground near his outstretched hand. But her eyes were not on the dead man. They were on Cole. He was leaning heavily against one of the main support beams. His left hand braced against the wood to keep himself upright. His gun was still in his right hand, smoke curling faintly from the barrel. His face, usually tanned and weathered, was pale, drawn with pain and shock, and his shirt, on his left shoulder, was soaked in a patch of brilliant, impossible red. The blood was welling up, a dark, viscous stream that dripped from his sleeve and spattered onto the dusty floorboards. He saw her, and his expression shifted. The hard mask of the fighter dissolved, replaced by a flicker of pain and something else, regret. He opened his mouth to speak, to tell her to get back down, but no words came out. He swayed, his knees buckling. The sight of his blood, of his strength failing, shattered the last of June's control. The fragile home they had built had been desecrated, and the man who was its foundation was bleeding, broken, because of her. The world tilted on its axis, the dusty barn floor seeming to rush up to meet her. She staggered forward, her legs turning to water. "Cole!" she choked out, his name a raw, broken thing. She reached him just as he began to slide down the beam, catching him, her small frame struggling to support his dead weight. The warm, sticky wetness of his blood soaked through her dress. She saw the wound then, a torn, ragged hole in the muscle of his shoulder, and a wave of nausea and despair washed over her. She lowered him to the ground, her movements frantic, clumsy. He groaned, his head lolling to the side, his eyes fluttering closed. "No," she whispered, her hands hovering over the wound, not knowing what to do. The danger she had brought to his door, the danger he had shielded her from, had finally struck him down. And in that moment of pure, unadulterated terror, the truth of her heart. The words she had held back for so long came spilling out in a desperate, ragged cry. "No!" she sobbed, cradling his head in her lap, her tears falling onto his pale, dirt-streaked face. "Oh God, Cole, I can't lose you." Panic is a merciless, smothering thief. It steals breath, thought, and reason, leaving behind only a raw, animal terror. For June, cradling Cole's unconscious form in the blood-soaked dust of the barn, the world had shrunk to the ragged, leaking hole in his shoulder and the terrifyingly shallow rhythm of his breathing. Her mind was a white-hot scream, a frantic, useless scramble for a solution that wasn't there. She tore a strip from the hem of her already tattered dress, her fingers clumsy, slick with his blood. She had to stop the bleeding. That was the only coherent thought that managed to surface through the waves of horror. She pressed the wadded fabric against the wound, a desperate, futile gesture. The dark, vital red simply soaked through it in seconds, her small effort mocked by the severity of the injury. His skin was clammy and pale beneath her touch, his face a mask of slack-jawed pain even in unconsciousness. "Cole, please!" she sobbed, the words a useless prayer offered to the dusty, blood-scented air. "Please wake up! Don't you leave me! Don't you dare leave me here!" Her world was a maelstrom of terror and grief. In the center of it was the man who had become her anchor, her protector, her home, and he was dying. He was dying because of her, because of the trouble she had dragged into his quiet, solitary life. The weight of her guilt was a physical thing, pressing down on her chest, making it impossible to draw a full breath. She was so consumed by her desperate, failing attempt at first aid that she didn't hear the second horse. She didn't register the soft thud of hooves or the creak of saddle leather until a voice, rough and guttural, sliced through her panic. "Well, well, looks like old Jedediah bit off more than he could chew." June's head snapped up. A man stood in the wide-open doorway, blocking the bright morning light, his form a huge, menacing silhouette. He was not like the first bounty hunter, the one he called Jedediah, who had been wiry and slick with his words. This man was built like a bull, with a barrel chest and thick, powerful arms. He wore a filthy leather vest over a sweat-stained shirt, and his face was a brutish landscape of pockmarks and a thick, untrimmed beard. His eyes, small and dark, raked over the scene with a cold, predatory assessment the dead man on the floor, Cole bleeding out at her feet, and her, the prize, helpless and cornered. He took a slow, deliberate step into the barn, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. He saw Cole's gun, the one that had fallen from his limp hand, lying in the dust just a few feet away. "Looks like my job just got a whole lot easier," the man grunted, his gaze fixing on June. "Finch said to bring you back alive, didn't say in how many pieces, and he didn't say nothing about what I could do before I brought you back." He took another step, his intentions a palpable, greasy stain on the air. This was a different kind of danger. Jedediah had been a wolf, but a wolf that could be reasoned with, perhaps. This man was a bear, a creature of brute force and simple, malevolent appetites. The fragile bubble of June's grief-stricken world shattered, replaced by a new, more immediate, and far more primal fear. This man was not going to capture her. He was going to destroy her. Her mind, which had been a chaotic storm, suddenly went preternaturally calm. The screaming stopped. A cold, hard clarity settled in its place. There were no options. There was no escape. There was no reasoning with the thing in the doorway. There was only the dead man on the floor, the dying man in her lap, and the monster that was coming for them both. All of Cole's lessons, which she had absorbed in the quiet safety of their shared days, came rushing to the forefront of her mind. A gun is loud. It brings attention. But there was no one to bring attention to. Read the stories others leave. The story this man was leaving was one of pure, remorseless violence. Don't fight it. Just guide it. The words he had spoken while teaching her to tie a snare now took on a new, terrible meaning. Her eyes flicked to the colt lying in the dust. It was a lifetime away, an impossible distance. "Get away from him," the man snarled. Taking another step, he was closer now, close enough she could smell the sour stench of whiskey and unwashed sweat on him. He gestured with his chin toward the dead man. "Jedediah was my partner. This son of a bitch is gonna pay for that, and then you are." He was enjoying this. He was savoring her fear, and in that moment, seeing the cruel pleasure in his piggish eyes, something inside June snapped. The terror did not vanish, but it was consumed by a volcanic eruption of pure, unadulterated rage. Rage for Cole, who had shown her nothing but quiet kindness and was now paying for it with his life. Rage for her mother, whose life had been stolen by men like this, men who took what they wanted without a thought for the pain they caused. Rage for herself, for a life spent being treated as property, as a victim, as a thing to be bartered and broken. No more. In a single fluid movement that she didn't know she was capable of, she gently lowered Cole's head to the ground, lunged across the dirt, and snatched up the Colt. The gun was shockingly heavy. It was a solid, alien weight in her hand, a thing of cold steel and deadly purpose. She had never held a weapon before in her life. It felt wrong. It felt profane, but it also felt like the only choice she had left in the entire world. The big man stopped, a look of genuine surprise on his face. He hadn't expected the terrified little rabbit to show teeth. The surprise quickly curdled back into a sneer. "You think you can use that, girlie? You're going to get yourself hurt." His hand started to move toward the pistol on his own hip. June scrambled backward, putting a few more feet between them, her other hand coming up to support the heavy weight of the gun. She held it out in front of her, her arms shaking so violently she wasn't sure she could even aim. The hammer was already cocked from when Cole had fired it. Her thumb rested against it, feeling the immense, coiled tension in the mechanism. Her mind was a maelstrom. She saw Cole's face, pale and bleeding. She saw the leering face of the first bounty hunter. She saw Abner Finch's cold, proprietary eyes. And she saw this brute in front of her, a man who intended to visit upon her every horror she had ever imagined. His hand is moving. Cole's voice, calm and clear from some half-remembered lesson. If they reach for the leather, it's too late to talk. She was not a killer. She was a girl who mended shirts and made bread, who found joy in the scent of wild mint. But that girl was about to die. To survive, she had to become something else, something as hard and as cold as the weapon in her hands. The man's smirk widened. He was faster. He knew it. He was toying with her. His hand dropped, his fingers wrapping around the grip of his pistol. And in that split second, time seemed to slow. June saw the movement, saw the glint in his eye, saw the end of her life rushing toward her. She closed her eyes. She thought of Cole's forehead pressed against hers, of his whispered words in the twilight. "Then let me be the second." She squeezed the trigger. The explosion was a physical force, a deafening, concussive roar that ripped through the barn and slammed into her. The gun kicked back with a brutal, shocking violence, wrenching her arms, the smell of gunpowder instantly filling her nostrils, acrid and choking. The world was noise and shock and the smell of fire. She opened her eyes. The big man was no longer smirking. He stood frozen for a half-second, a look of utter, blank disbelief on his face. A small, dark hole had appeared in the center of his filthy leather vest. He looked down at it, as if mildly curious about this new, unexpected development. Then his eyes rolled back in his head, his knees buckled, and he crashed to the floor like a felled oak tree, his fall shaking the very timbers of the barn. He did not move again. Silence, a profound ringing, absolute silence, broken only by the high-pitched keen in June's own ears. She stood there, the heavy Colt still clutched in her trembling hands, pointed at the space where the man had been. Smoke curled from the barrel, a ghostly gray snake in the dusty air. She stared at the second body, this mountain of a man she had just extinguished. She had taken a life. The finality of it was a staggering, soul-shattering weight. A wave of nausea so powerful it made her dizzy washed over her. She dropped the gun as if it were burning hot, and it landed with a heavy thud in the dust. Her body was a riot of rebellion. Her legs gave out, and she sank to her knees. A violent, uncontrollable tremor seized her, shaking her from head to foot. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold her splintering self together. She had done it. She had killed a man. She had become a monster to fight a monster. And then, through the ringing in her ears, she heard a sound, a low, soft groan. Her head snapped toward Cole. He was stirring. His brow was furrowed in pain, and his eyelids were fluttering. He was alive. The sight of it, the simple, miraculous fact of his life, cut through her shock like a knife. The dead men, the gunshot, her own transformation, it all faded into the background. All that mattered was him. She crawled to his side, her movements jerky, uncoordinated. "Cole," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken croak. His eyes flickered open. They were cloudy with pain and confusion. Struggling to focus, he looked at her. Then his gaze drifted past her, to the two bodies lying on the barn floor. Understanding, slow and horrifying, dawned in his eyes. He looked back at her, at the smoking gun lying in the dirt beside her, at her trembling form. He saw the truth of what had happened while he was gone from the world. He tried to speak, but only a pained rasp came out. He lifted his good hand, his fingers barely brushing her arm. It was enough. It was a connection. It was life. The dam of her control finally broke. The terror, the rage, the shock, the profound, earth-shattering relief, it all came pouring out in a single, convulsive sob. Tears streamed down her face, washing clean paths through the grime and gunpowder residue. She looked at him, at his living, breathing face, and the awful, incredible truth of what she had done crystallized into a single, desperate thought. She had saved him. She had saved them. "I did it!" she cried, the words torn from the very core of her being. A sound that was half sob, half triumph. "Cole, I did it!" The aftermath of violence is not loud, but a deafening, ringing silence. June knelt in that silence, her world reduced to three still forms on the dusty floor, two men who were gone forever, and one man who was terrifyingly close to joining them. Her desperate cry, "I did it," echoed in the quiet barn. Not a boast of victory, but a raw, ragged testament to her own survival. Cole's flicker of consciousness was brief. His eyes, clouded with pain, registered the scene, registered her, and then rolled back, surrendering once more to the encroaching darkness. The brief connection, his touch on her arm, was severed, leaving her terribly, completely alone with the carnage. The girl who had once fumbled with a snare wire was gone, burned away in the flash of a gunshot. In her place was a woman forged in terror and necessity. The panic was still there, a cold, hard knot in her belly, but it no longer paralyzed her. It fueled her. Her first thought was singular and clear. Cole. He was losing blood, and his breathing was shallow. He couldn't stay here, on the cold, filthy ground. With strength she didn't know she possessed, she managed to drag him, inch by agonizing inch, away from the center of the barn and onto his own bedroll, which she positioned in the cleanest corner. She propped his head and shoulders up with a saddlebag to help his breathing. Next, the wound. It was a brutal, ugly thing. The bounty hunter's bullet had torn through the thick muscle of his shoulder, an exit wound on his back showing it had gone clean through. It was a small mercy. At least the lead wasn't still inside him. She knew from her mother's lessons in tending to ranch hands that the two greatest dangers were bleeding and fever. She ran to his saddlebags, her mind racing. He was a man who lived alone in the wilderness. He would have supplies. She found what she was looking for, a small cloth pouch containing a packet of dried yarrow staunchweed. Her mother had called it a needle, and a coil of clean catgut. There was also a flask of whiskey. For a moment, she was just a girl again, her hands shaking, overwhelmed by the task. Then she looked at Cole's pale, still face, and the woman took over once more. She tore more strips from her long-suffering dress, using the whiskey to clean the needle and her own trembling hands. She packed the wound with the yarrow, her stomach churning at the intimate, gruesome work. Then began the painstaking process of stitching the torn flesh together. Her stitches were not neat or practiced, but they were tight, they were desperate, they were a plea against death itself. When she was done, she bandaged the wound tightly with the cleanest cloth she could find. Only then did she allow herself to confront the other reality in the barn. The two dead men. They could not stay. They were a testament to the violence that had invaded their sanctuary. And they were an invitation to infection and predators. This was the hardest task. It was a physical and spiritual ordeal that would mark her forever. She started with the big man, the one she had shot. She couldn't look at his face. She looped a rope under his arms and, using one of the support beams as a fulcrum, she strained, her muscles screaming, her breath coming in ragged sobs, and dragged him out of the barn and into the unforgiving glare of the sun. She did the same with Jedediah. The work was brutal, soul-crushing. By the time she was finished, she was covered in dust and sweat and the filth of her grim task, her body trembling with exhaustion and revulsion. She left them there, away from the barn, an offering to the vast, indifferent desert. She took their guns, laying them carefully inside, and led their horses far away before setting them loose. She could not bring herself to profit from the grim transaction. For the next 3 days, the barn became a sick room, a church, a purgatory. June did not sleep. She dozed, sitting upright against the wall by Cole's side, her hand resting on his good arm, her entire being focused on the rise and fall of his chest. He was lost in a fever dream, tossing and turning, muttering names she didn't know and words that had no meaning. His skin was fire, his body slick with sweat. She became his tender. She bathed his face and chest with cool water from the spring. She forced sips of water between his cracked lips, praying he wouldn't choke. She checked his wound constantly, cleaning it with whiskey-soaked rags, her heart in her throat every time she peeled back the bandage, terrified of what she might find. She talked to him, her voice a low, constant murmur. She told him about her childhood, about her mother's garden, about the books she used to read. She told him he was strong, that he had to fight, that he could not leave her. She poured all of her hope, all of her burgeoning love, into that one-sided conversation, hoping some of it might anchor him to the world. During those long, terrifying days and nights, words like love were never spoken. They were entirely inadequate for what was passing between them. Love was the grim set of her jaw as she cleaned his wound. Love was the fierce, protective glare she cast at the empty doorway, as if daring death itself to enter. Love was the exhaustion that etched dark circles under her eyes, and the way she would instinctively reach out in her light sleep to make sure he was still breathing. For his part, even in his delirium, he seemed to know she was there. Sometimes, his restless hand would grope blindly until it found hers, his fingers gripping hers with surprising strength, as if she were a lifeline in a raging storm. And she would hold on, whispering to him, "I'm here, Cole. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." On the 4th morning, the fever broke. She awoke from a brief, fitful doze to find him looking at her. His eyes were no longer cloudy and unfocused, but clear, lucid, and filled with a profound, bone-deep weariness. He was weak, his face gaunt, but he was himself. "June!" he rasped, his voice a dry, cracked whisper. A sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaped her. "You're back," she breathed, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Oh, thank God, you're back." He tried to sit up, but a sharp intake of breath and a spasm of pain in his shoulder sent him falling back against the saddlebag. "The others," he managed. "They're gone," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I took care of it." He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the new, hard strength in her eyes, the grim set of her mouth, the raw, blistered skin on her hands. He saw the woman who had dragged 2 dead men out into the sun and fought a fever with nothing but cool water and sheer, stubborn will. The awe in his eyes was a more powerful declaration than any poem. He understood the terrible price she had paid to keep him alive. He simply reached out his good hand and laid it on her arm. His touch was a thank you, an apology, a vow. The days that followed were quiet, gentle, and filled with a healing peace. As his strength slowly returned, their roles were reversed. He was the patient, and she was the caregiver, the one in command. She made him thin broth from the last of their jerky, spooning it into his mouth when he was too weak to lift his head. She read to him from a small, worn book of poems she found in his saddlebag, her voice soft in the warm afternoon air. He was not a good patient. He was a man of action, and being helpless chafed at him. He would try to stand, to do things for himself, and she would gently but firmly push him back down. "Rest," she would command, and to his own surprise, he would obey. He would watch her as she moved about the barn, her presence a constant, soothing balm. He watched the way the sunlight caught in her dark hair, the determined set of her chin, the innate grace in her movements. He was falling in love not with the frightened girl he had found by the creek, but with the fierce, resilient woman who had saved his life. Their communication remained largely unspoken, a language of gestures and shared glances. It was in the way she would adjust his bandages, her touch infinitely tender. It was in the way his eyes would follow her everywhere she went, a look of quiet, wondering adoration on his face. It was in the small, crooked smile he would give her when she brought him a cup of mint tea. They were healing together, not just his body, but their souls, knitting themselves together in the quiet sanctuary of the barn. One evening, about a week after the shooting, he was finally strong enough to sit up on his own, his back resting against the barn wall. The sun had set, and the world outside was a deep, soft velvet, studded with stars. A single candle, another treasure from his pack, flickered between them, casting a warm, intimate glow. June was sitting on a low stool, mending her dress, the one she had torn to pieces to save him. He was watching her, as he so often did. He noticed, not for the first time, a faint, silvery line on the side of her neck, just below her ear. It was an old scar, barely visible in the candlelight, a relic of some past, forgotten pain. In the context of all the new hurts she had endured, it seemed both trivial and profound. He reached out his good hand, not to her hand, but to her neck. She stopped her sewing, her head tilting slightly as his fingers gently, reverently, traced the line of the old scar. His touch was feather-light, a question, a memory. She did not pull away. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, a silent acknowledgement of this shared, quiet intimacy. He let his fingers linger there for a moment, on that mark of old vulnerability. He looked at her face, softened by the candlelight, and he thought of the terror she had faced, the violence she had met with a strength that humbled him. The words rose in him then, simple, direct, and carrying the weight of everything they had survived. "You deserve to be cherished," he whispered, his voice a low, rough murmur in the stillness of the night. He saw her eyes flutter open, deep, shining pools in the candlelight. To be kept safe from all this. He paused, his thumb stroking her skin. "But you're strong enough to protect the one you care for, too." It was not a declaration of love in the way the poets wrote about it. It was something more. It was a statement of fact, a testament to her spirit. It was his way of saying, "I see you, All of you. The part that needs protecting and the part that is the protector. And I honor them both." It was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to her. Cole's recovery was as slow and as steady as the desert sun rising each morning. The deep, tearing pain in his shoulder gradually subsided into a dull, persistent ache, a constant reminder of how close he had come to the edge, with June's relentless, tender care. The angry red of the wound softened, and new, pink skin began to knit the ravaged flesh together. Strength seeped back into his limbs, and the gaunt, haunted look in his face was replaced by the quiet, weathered competence she had come to know so well. He began to move about the barn, his left arm still held carefully against his side, but his stride regaining its long, easy rhythm. He would stand for hours with his horse, dust murmuring to the animal, his good hand stroking its neck in long, soothing passes. He took back the task of cleaning his rifle, his movements still precise, though more deliberate than before. He was reclaiming himself, piece by piece, and as he healed, the dynamic between them shifted once more. She was no longer his nurse, and he was no longer her patient. They were simply Cole and June, partners in this quiet, isolated world they had built. They worked side by side, their movements an easy, unspoken choreography. He taught her how to properly bank a fire so it would smolder for hours, and she taught him the simple pleasure of watching the shapes of clouds as they drifted across the vast, empty sky. The question of their future hung between them, a silent, shimmering thing. The immediate danger had passed, but they both knew it was not a permanent state. The world was still out there. Abner Finch was still out there. The satchel with its dark secrets still sat in the corner of the barn, a silent testament to a life left behind. But they didn't speak of it. To speak of the future was to acknowledge the possibility of an end to this fragile, precious present. So they lived in the now, a series of quiet, sun-drenched days, each one a gift. The change came not with the arrival of a rider or the distant sound of a gunshot, but with a shift in the air itself. The seasons in the high desert do not turn gently, they break. For a week, the heat had been suffocating, the sky a pale, hazy, bleached-out blue. The air was thick, still, and heavy, making every breath feel like a conscious effort. Then, one afternoon, the wind died completely. An unnatural, oppressive silence fell over the landscape. The birds went quiet. The insects ceased their humming. Cole, who had been repairing a bridle just outside the barn, stood up and looked to the southwest. A dark, bruised-looking line of clouds was massing on the horizon, thick and heavy like a pooling stain of ink. He sniffed the air. It had a strange, metallic tang to it, the smell of ozone and distant, thirsty dust. "It's coming," he said, his voice a low rumble. June came to stand beside him, her hand shielding her eyes against the strange, yellow glare of the sun. She looked at the ominous wall of clouds, at the way they seemed to be boiling up from the earth. A year ago, a month ago, even a week ago, this sight would have filled her with a primal dread. A storm was a force of raw, untamed power, a reminder of her own smallness and vulnerability in a world that could crush her without a thought. It would have meant cold and fear and the terror of being alone against the elements. But as she stood there, with Cole's solid, reassuring presence beside her, she felt no fear. There was a strange sense of anticipation, of excitement. The world was holding its breath, and so was she. "We should bring Dust inside," she said, her voice calm and steady. They worked together, preparing their sanctuary for the coming deluge. They secured the heavy crossbar Cole had built for the main door. They checked the roof, pushing stray clumps of old hay into the largest gaps. They brought in their remaining firewood, stacking it in a dry corner. Every action was efficient, collaborative, a testament to the partnership they had forged. By the time the first drops of rain began to fall, the world outside was cloaked in a premature twilight. The drops were huge and fat, splattering against the parched earth with a sound like 100 tiny drums. They left dark, spreading circles in the dust, and the air was suddenly filled with the rich, intoxicating scent of petrichor, the smell of rain on a thirsty land. Cole slid open the small side door, the one that looked out over the vast, sloping plain, and they stood together in the opening, watching the storm roll in. The wind came first, a low moan that grew into a rushing roar, bending the scrubby mesquite trees and whipping dust into swirling devils. Then the rain came in earnest, not as drops, but as a solid, gray driving sheet that blurred the horizon and turned the world to water. The sound was immense, a deafening, continuous roar as the deluge hammered against the old tin roof. It was a wild, chaotic symphony, a sound loud enough to drown out all thought. A flash of brilliant, blue-white lightning momentarily illuminated the landscape, followed a heartbeat later by a crack of thunder so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the barn. June flinched, an old, instinctive reaction, but the fear was absent. The sound was just that, a sound. It held no menace for her. Not anymore. She was not alone. She was not exposed. She was home. She leaned her head against Cole's good shoulder, and his arm came around her, pulling her close. They stood like that for a long time, silent, watching the spectacle. The desert, which she had known only as a place of harsh, burnt oranges and dusty browns, was undergoing a miraculous transformation. The dry washes and arroyos, which had been scars on the land, were now running with brown, churning water. The parched earth was drinking greedily, turning a deep, rich, chocolatey brown. Life, which had been hiding, hunkered down, waiting, was now stirring. The storm was a cleansing. It was washing away the dust, the blood, the memory of violence. It was washing the world clean, making it new again. And as she stood there, tucked into the shelter of Cole's embrace, the rhythmic, deafening roar of the rain on the roof a kind of lullaby, June felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. She thought of her life before, a life lived in houses that were not homes, first as the daughter of a broken man, then as the property of a cruel one. She had never belonged anywhere. She had always been a guest, a pawn, a possession, a fugitive. Her existence had been defined by the spaces she occupied in other people's lives. She had never had a space of her own. But this place, this ruined, silver-walled barn, with its scent of hay and dust and the man standing beside her, this felt different. This was not a place she was hiding in. It was a place she was living in. She had not just been given shelter here, she had helped to build it. Her stitches were in his clothes. Her scent was in the air. Her own quiet strength was now woven into the very fabric of their shared existence. For the first time, she was not an accessory to a place. She was a part of it. The rain began to soften, the deafening roar subsiding to a steady, rhythmic drumming. The world outside was awash in the soft, gray light of the storm's aftermath. June looked out at the rain-soaked plains, at the new, temporary streams that glittered in the dim light, and a slow, quiet smile spread across her face. She turned her head, looking up at Cole. His face was serene, his eyes fixed on the horizon, but she knew he was completely aware of her. He was always aware of her. "For the first time," she said, her voice soft, almost lost in the sound of the rain. "I feel like I belong somewhere." Her words were a simple truth, an admission that was more profound than any declaration of love. He turned his head then, his dark eyes meeting hers. He saw no fear in them, no desperation. He saw only a quiet, steady light. He saw the woman she had become, here in this place, with him. He didn't speak. He simply leaned down and rested his forehead against hers, just as he had done on the evening of their first kiss. His touch was warm, solid, an anchor in the rain-swept world. They stood there for a long moment, their eyes closed, breathing in the scent of the wet earth and each other. a silent communion that needed no words. Then he whispered, his voice a low, rough murmur against her skin, a promise that was both an answer and a beginning. Then stay. Every day I'll kiss you like it's the second time. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories, 1850, and like this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.